Well, it is really great to be back with you guys today. 2 weeks ago, yesterday, Peg and I were in Scotland, where our daughter and son-in-law celebrated their wedding anniversary, their third wedding anniversary, with a service in which they renewed their vows, and that was their wedding vows, kind of a blessing of that wedding. And then it was followed by a really fun reception in which they had a chance to celebrate their marriage with family and friends who hadn't been able to attend the small wedding ceremony that took place 3 years ago. So my son-in-law, who is a computer programmer, called this Wedding 2.0, and that was the one that actually had the reception and stuff. This was a little different than the other ceremony. Peg actually got to walk Ruth down the aisle this time. I did during Wedding 1.0. I had the privilege this time of both officiating at the ceremony as well as giving the father of the bride speech, which I have to admit I choked up a couple of times, not surprisingly. Like many of the guests there, I wore a kilt, and as promised, here is a photo of me in that kilt. Now, I have been asked if this is a family tartan, and the answer to that is no, it is not. It's actually a slight variation of the clergy tartan, and this variation is called the muted clergy tartan. The colors are just slightly different. And I chose a muted clergy tartan, number one, because I really liked it, but also I didn't really want to be confused with those more flamboyant clergy out there. I'm a muted clergy, so. The celebration was definitely a cross-cultural event. It had people who came together from Scotland, from Ireland. Man, I love the Irish relatives. They are awesome. People from England, people from other countries in the EU. Of course, Ruth's friends and family from the United States and elsewhere. We did ceilidh dancing. We belted out Scottish folk songs. We sang the Proclaimers 500 Miles. They're from Edinburgh, after all. I got over my Neil Diamond hang-up and actually sang along with Sweet Caroline. And as a nod to the Yanks who were present, we actually cooked s'mores over an open fire. The morning of the wedding, cross-cultural experience, I had haggis as part of my breakfast. It really was. It was a cross-cultural mashup, and it was a blast. I wish we could do it again. It was really, really fun. Now, I wanted to share that with you this morning, not only to let you know how I spent my summer vacation, but also to make a point. And the point is this. Most of the time, my life is pretty predictable. I bet most of the time, your life is pretty predictable too. I mean, I'm a creature of habit. I get up pretty much the same time every day. And I have the same morning routine, and I have pretty much the same thing for breakfast, and I drive the same way to work. And when I'm at work, I, do pretty much the same stuff. I hang out with the same people. I have the same stuff for lunch. And we have a limited repertoire of what we make for dinner. To be honest, I'm kind of happy with that. It's really nice. It's comfortable. The reason you keep doing it is because, obviously, it works. But one of the things I realize is, I kind of live in a bubble. And you don't realize you live in a bubble until you meet other people who do stuff differently. I think most of us live in a bubble. One of the reasons that I absolutely love to travel is because it gets me out of the bubble. And I get to meet new people and see new places and have new experiences and try new food, and it's great. A couple months ago, I was listening to a podcast. It's one of the things I do when I take my habitual, walks in the evening, which I do most of the time. But I was listening to this podcast called Invisibilia. It's a really interesting podcast because it's about the invisible forces that shape our lives. things like our emotions and the culture in which we live and this kind of stuff. And I want to share with you a couple stories that I heard on this podcast. But before I do, I want to ask you a question. How many of you guys today own pets? Would you raise your hand if you have a pet? Okay, great, thanks. You can put your hands down. How many of you have cats? Okay, hands down. How many of you have dogs? Okay, any both? Okay. I'm not asking that because I want to have a cats versus dogs war here. Nothing like that. But let me ask another question. And this is when you don't have to raise your hands, but I'm just think about this for a second. How well do you think you know your pets? I mean, even they may have been a part of your life for 10 or 20 years. How well do you really know them? Do you suppose? When Alexandra Horowitz was a little girl, her dog Astor went missing. This is Alexandra Horowitz today. This little dog Astor went missing. Now, most of the time, every evening, her family would open the door, and Astor would run out, and she'd do her thing, and then she would come back. But this one particular evening, they opened the door, Astor took off, and she didn't come back. Didn't come back for a couple of days. When she finally found her way back home, this little girl, Alexandra, wondered what she'd been up to. What had she been doing out there? And she realized that Astor had a life of her own that she wasn't privy to. She had no clue. And actually, that experience led her to becoming a psychologist, a psychology professor. She earned a doctorate specializing in, get this, animal cognition. How animals think. Now, during the course of her studies to earn this doctorate, Dr. Horowitz started out doing some fairly predictable stuff, things that you would expect psychology researchers to do. She filmed dogs, and then she would watch frame by frame so she could learn as much as she could about how the dogs moved and how they kind of interacted with their environment and so on. But as she sat in this place watching these movies of dogs doing stuff, she felt like she was missing something. It was something really important. It wasn't really getting at the essence of who the dog is. And then it came to her. And when it came to her, it seemed so obvious that she wondered how she had missed it. You ready for this? Smell. Smell. That's what dogs do. It's how they relate to the world. For us as people, how do we relate to the world? It's mostly through sight and sound. Dogs relate to the world in a very, very different. They see the world in black and white, but man, they smell the world in living color. We smell the world in black and white. So rather than sitting in an office and watching films of dogs doing stuff, Dr. Horowitz decided that she was going to start smelling what they smelled. And so what's really funny about this is that she realized, man, I'm a rubbish smeller. I don't know how to smell. I haven't really developed that, that ability. And so she started teaching herself how to smell. Now, how would you go about doing that? Well, she started smelling perfume so she could tell the difference between that. Some of you will like the next thing she did. She started smelling and drinking wine. Tell the difference, between all of that stuff. And she got better and better and better through practice at developing her sense of smell. And then once she felt like, okay, I'm starting to get a little handle on this, she got down to business. She lives in Manhattan, New York City, Manhattan. She decided that she was going to start taking her dogs on these long walks through New York City, and whenever they slowed down and started to smell something, she's going to get down on all fours, and she was going to smell what they smelled. She's a professional. Don't try this at home. So she would smell trees and fire hydrants and fences and buildings and unidentifiable stuff that was lying on the curb, dead birds and squirrels. She smelled anything and she smelled everything, with the sole exception of other dogs. How shall I put this delicately? Maybe I should just stop and say she would not smell other dogs. Now, all of this smelling actually led her into experiencing reality the way the dogs do. And she learned some amazing stuff. And I don't know if this has ever occurred to you. It's never occurred to me, but do you know she learned that a dog's sense of smell can actually reveal history? Now, how do they do that? A dog can tell through smell what's happened someplace and how long ago it happened. They can tell if, a group of dogs have been through there before. For us, just looking at the scene, we got no clue. But there are smells that are left behind. They can tell, an animal died here, and it was, kind of this long ago. And not only can a dog's sense of smell reveal history, dog's sense of smell can also predict the future. And how is that even possible? Because a dog, when some wind, kicks up, dog can sense maybe what's around the next corner, way before we have any idea what we'll find there. It's fascinating because a place that could be completely uninteresting from a visual point of view, nothing happening. For a dog, it's like, wow, this is amazing. This is incredible what's happened here. I'm so excited about what's going to happen next. You know what? Most of us don't know that stuff. Even if we think we know our pets. Most of us don't know that stuff, and here's why. Because we never get out of our human bubble. It's where we live. The podcast hosts of this podcast, Invisibility, and the same podcast, they go on to talk about this guy named Max Hawkins. Now, Max Hawkins lives in San Francisco. He's a computer programmer who works for Google, or at least did. I don't know if he still does. But for whatever reason, Max started feeling like his life was kind of being limited by his habits. Now, don't get me wrong, like my habits, probably like your habits. It's not like they were bad habits. He loved living in San Francisco, loves his city, loves his work at Google. What a stimulating place to be. He loves his friends, the same people that he has just always hung out with. He loves his favorite coffee place, and they know him, and every time he goes in, there's this special kind of coffee they make for him and all that. Loves his favorite restaurants, and he returns to them. But one of the things is, for whatever reason, he just started thinking about how the way his life was structured was actually kind of limiting him in a way. That there was a much bigger world out there. So, what do you do if you're a computer programmer, work at Google, feel your life's limiting you and everything? He invented an app. And what the app did is this. The app would go onto social media. It would find out what public events were taking place. It would randomly choose one for him, and he would go to it. Whether he knew the people or not, and he didn't. So the very first time he does this, sends him to this, this address, and he knocks on the door, and this Russian guy opens the door, and it's a group of 7 young Russian professionals who get together every so often to drink vodka, tell stories, support and encourage one another. And they say, "What are you doing here?" That kind of thing. And he says, "Oh, I had this app and it just randomly brought me here," and all this kind of stuff. And they were kind of suspicious at first, but he said, "Oh, come on in." And by the end of the night, he's drinking vodka with them, telling stories, and just, he made new friends. Another time, I think he's from Fresno, and is going home to Fresno for Christmas, and he gets his app out, and he says, "What am I going to do today?" And the app sends him to this Christmas party. It's posted as a public Christmas party. He goes to the address, knocks on the door. This older woman opens the door and says, "Oh, hello, I'm so glad you're here. I don't know if we've met before." And he introduces himself and tells the story, and she goes, "That's great. Come inside." Turns out she's a retired psychology professor. It's just this little tiny Christmas party. It involves them sitting down, having dinner together, and then by the end of the evening, they're all sitting around piano, singing Christmas carols together. If you're following along on your YouVersion notes, you can actually see a video of them singing Christmas carols together. It looks like they've known each other for 20 years. They've probably known each other for about 2 hours. This really intrigued. When the host of this podcast heard about this guy and what he did, this sounded so intriguing to them, they said, "We ought to try that." So they contacted him. He was going to be in Des Moines for reasons we'll mention in just a minute. But he ends up in Des Moines. They fly out to meet him. They bring along some recording equipment because they said, "This might be interesting to put on the podcast," and all this kind of stuff. The app sends them to this bar that only serves beer, whiskey, and vodka. They don't know anybody there. It's sort of a redneck place, if you'll forgive the term. The people, the patrons there, super suspicious. They want to know, what are these people doing, showing up with all this recording equipment? They think they're like narcs or feds, or I don't know what they think, but they're really suspicious. But Max has been used to people being suspicious of him showing up and everything, so he just tells them the story. He says, "Oh yeah, I'm this guy, I just do this, and I meet..." And over the course of time, they get to talking about country music and all this kind of stuff. Suddenly they become, by the end of the evening, they're saying, "You guys got to come back, this was great, it's so much fun meeting you." Max he invented another app, and by the way, both of these apps are available on the App Store, so if you want to try it, you can do this. He also invented an app that tells him where to take his vacations. Over the years, Max has made friends with people he otherwise never would have known during trips to Hong Kong, Dubai, Slovenia, Germany, all over the place. But in order to make those friends, Max had to decide to get outside of the bubble. And we all live in a bubble, don't we? So, here we go. Cross-cultural wedding in Scotland. And an animal cognition psychologist sniffing her way around the streets of Manhattan. And this guy from Google who invents an app that introduces him to people he doesn't know. What do all three of those stories have in common? What do they have to do with us? And most important of all, when do you get to fill in those 3 blanks in your message notes? Because we are creatures of habit, and they must be filled in. Well, here's how all of those stories relate to us as Christians. This is a super important point. The longer we are Christians, the more likely we live in a Christian bubble. The longer we're Christians, the more likely we live in a Christian bubble. That's because the longer we're Christians, the more comfortable and familiar we're going to be with worship. Some of us, when we first show up to worship, maybe we don't have any church background, or it's been a really long time. We grew up in a church where it's organs and choirs and stuff like that, and we show up in church and it's totally different, and there are songs that we don't know, and people we don't know, and all that kind of stuff. But man, after you start coming for a while, the more familiar worship feels. The longer you're Christian, the more Christian friends you have. The more comfortable you're going to be with the Bible. More comfortable you're going to be with Christian words. We have our own language as Christians that other people don't understand. We say things that other people don't say. Who else besides Christians, say, we're going to go out and love on people? Anybody? I don't know any. It's Christianese. The longer we're Christian, the more we're going to be comfortable with the Christian biblical worldview. And that sense of comfort, that sense of familiarity comes from, and this is a really good thing, it comes from having an identity that is increasingly rooted in who we are in Jesus Christ. This is one of the reasons why we just did this series on the 3 core values that shape our lives here at Stonebridge Community Church. And what are they? They are worship, they are group or community life, and they are serving others. And when you do those things, you know what happens inevitably over time? Your relationship with God deepens. Your relationship with other people in the church family deepens. The more your sense of who you are in Christ, kind of solidifies. That's all really, really good. It's exciting. It's important stuff. But the problem is this. The more Christian friends we have, the fewer friends we have who don't know Christ. The more familiar we become with Christian language, the more comfortable we become with a biblical worldview, the less likely we are to hang out with people who don't share them. And the less able we are to understand where they're coming from, even though maybe that's where we came from. We forget. And why is that a problem? Why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because of Jesus. Because Jesus says, in the Sermon of the Mount of all places, he says, you are the light of the world. City set on a hill can't be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand. And he says, why? Why we put it on a stand? Because it gives light to all in the house. And then he says, in the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven. Can we be salt of the earth if we stay in the salt shaker? Can we be the light of the world if we just hang out together in a holy huddle and never venture out? In Matthew chapter 28, same gospel in which we find the Sermon on the Mount. Here we're at the whereas the Sermon on the Mount's near the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew 28 is the very end. And Jesus is instructing his disciples. He's been crucified. He's risen from the dead. He's about to return to heaven. But before he does, he instructs his disciples as to what they are doing until he returns again. And these words are called the Great Commission. And some variation of the Great Commission is found in all 4 Gospels as well as the book of Acts. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts. Every single time in each of those Gospels and in Acts, Jesus is instructing his disciples. In the version in which it's written in Matthew, very familiar. Go, he says. Go. Get out there. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey all that I have commanded you. You know, there is no way that we can be faithful to that commandment. There's no way we can obey it if we stay inside a bubble. We cannot follow Jesus. We can't go and make disciples and teach them what Jesus has taught us without leaving the Christian bubble long enough to make a difference in the life of those who need Christ. And this is why Jesus spends so much time in the Gospels training and instructing his disciples and then sending them out. And sometimes he sends them out on these short-term mission trips just so they can get kind of some experience so that he can teach them and train them a little bit more. This is why the early church grew like wildfire. I mean, if you were to chart out the growth of the early Christian church, you would see this exponential curve. It's not like the church in America today, which is kind of a flattened out plateau. It was exponential growth. And why was that? It's because of people like the Apostle Paul, who poured out their lives sharing Jesus Christ with others. Because he knew that their lives, their salvation depended on it. Because he knew he was called. He was responsible as a follower of Jesus to share the good news with other people. That's the only way people become Christians. You know, there's only one place that I know of in the New Testament where the church didn't grow. And it didn't grow because the position of this particular congregation was that if you wanted to be a follower of Jesus, you have to come to us and you have to adopt all of our rules and all this kind of stuff. Rather than going out, they expected people to come in. And what was the church? Jerusalem. It was a Jerusalem church. Church elsewhere grew like wildfire. The church in Jerusalem did not. You know, the Apostle Paul, Peter, the other disciples of Jesus, and then those whom they brought to Christ, they went to where people were. They loved people where they were. They shared Jesus with people where they were. And you know what? God honored that, and people believed. Now, given human nature, and we all have to deal with that because we're all human, given human nature, the easiest thing for us to do in any situation, the easiest thing to do in any situation is to do what's most comfortable, right? And what makes us most comfortable? What is the most comfortable thing for us to do as Christians? Nothing. Nothing. We have to admit that. You know, there's part of us, human nature. Sometimes the Bible refers to this as our carnal nature or whatever, but, you know, it's basically human nature. Human nature is such that, given our druthers, we would do nothing. And this is why it takes courage, and it takes faith, and it takes intentionality for us to venture outside of the Christian bubble. The easiest thing for us to do is stay inside the bubble, stay inside the holy huddle, to never take a risk, to do nothing. It takes courage and faith and intentionality to venture outside the Christian bubble. But, and this is super important, it is worth it. It's worth a little discomfort. So knowing that it takes courage, knowing that it takes faith and intentionality, one of the things that we as leaders here at Stonebridge Community Church have tried to do is we have tried to make it a little easier for you guys this week to venture outside of the Christian bubble. And how have we done that? This past week, we sent out over 40,000 direct mail pieces to folks in our community. You probably received, some of you may be here today because you got one of these things in the mail. It's actually for the message series that starts next week, but we're really happy you're here. But one of the reasons we sent them out is because not only do we want to invite people and hope that a card will, touch somebody who's already open and searching and so on, we also want to equip you guys too to just have a conversation with people that you know. It doesn't have to, you don't have to bring them to Jesus. You don't have to convict them of sin. You don't have to do anything. All you have to do is say, hey, did you get the card in the mail? That's my church. And if you're interested, I'd love to have you go. I mean, and this, talk about making it easy. The message series that we're doing next week, starting next week, it's going to be a really, really great series. Don't let fear define your future. We live in a time where there's just a lot of fear out there. Would you agree with that? I mean, how could you not turn on the news and be a little bit anxious about stuff? And that's not to mention, just the personal fears that people have. And we're going to talk about fears that are common to everybody. Stuff like the fear of failure, the fear of change, fear of loneliness, the fear of criticism. I think we've all felt those fears. And sometimes those fears become so real to us that they actually, keep us from rising to our full potential and stature, not just as human beings, but as brothers and sisters, children of God. And one of the things that you need to know is this is a series that you can feel totally confident inviting your friends to, knowing that we're going to be looking at issues that are relevant to their lives. And they're relevant to our lives. But to do that, you have to venture outside of the Christian bubble. But you know what happens when you venture outside? Life becomes an adventure. That still doesn't mean, though, we won't feel a little bit of reluctance. I mean, for some people, just hearing me say, we ought to invite somebody, invite our friends, coworkers, neighbors, whatever, to think, we go, I could never do that. Where's that coming from, that reluctance? And how do we overcome it? Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, it comes from the fact that the easiest thing to do is what's most comfortable, and can sometimes be uncomfortable having a conversation because we don't want people to think we're lunatics or, those people or, But here's something really interesting and that I've learned this past week. There's a book that came out a number of years ago, a couple decades ago actually. It was written by Rebecca Pippert, and it's called Out of the Salt Shaker and Into the World. And it's based on that text. You're the salt of the earth, but if the salt's lost its taste, its flavor, it's not good for anything except to be thrown out. She's talking about how do we get outside the salt shaker. Think of this big old building here. This building is the salt shaker. How do we get out of this and into the world? One of the things that she points out in this book is, how you feel uncomfortable, with talking about your faith? The people that you're talking to probably feel uncomfortable about you doing that too. Now, here's the thing that's interesting about that. What that means is, rather than that being a problem, actually that's a cool thing, because what it means is you have something in common. And all you have to do is just admit, you know what, I feel a little funny talking about this because, I don't want to be one of those kind of people, whatever the stereotype is of Christians or whatever. Just to acknowledge that and say, it makes me feel a little bit awkward, but, I just like you so much. And this thing that we're doing next week is so cool, I decided to overcome my reluctance to do that. Just to be honest and say that you feel uncomfortable suddenly puts you in a different category. You're no longer one of those people that's out there, blah, blah, blah. You're like, man, this is really hard for me, but I just, care so much about you, I wanted to invite you. And they go, wow, I've never heard a Christian talk like that before. Does that make sense? Bibbert says, the thing that Christians and non-Christians absolutely have in common is that we're both uptight about evangelism. So if you want to build bridges with your non-Christian friends, just admit that. Let them know you feel that way, that you're a little bit uncomfortable, but you like them. And that just opens doors. Now, what I'm about to say may be the single most important thing I'm going to say in the message today. So we're going to wrap it up with this. The truth is, the longer that we are Christians and the more Christian friends we have, the more we need people in our lives who don't know Jesus. Can I repeat that? Because it might be counterintuitive. The longer we've been Christians and the more Christian friends we have, the more we need people in our lives who don't know Jesus. We need them. And they need us. Because we need them because we can't follow Jesus without venturing outside the Christian bubble where the people who need Jesus live. Like he said, you're the salt of the earth. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt's lost its taste, what good is it? Except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You're the light of the world. You are the light of the world. The city set on a hill can't be hidden. Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand, so that everybody in the house can see. In the same way, Jesus says, let your light shine before others. And there's only one way we can let our light shine. And that is if we venture outside the Christian bubble to bring Christ to those who, like us, need the hope that only He can bring.